Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, May 29th, 2025. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Netanyahu is threatening to upend U.S.-Iran talks. So the New York Times reported on Wednesday that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is threatening to upend negotiations between the U.S. and Iran by potentially attacking Iranian nuclear facilities. The report said that the threat from Israel led to a recent tense phone call between Netanyahu and President Trump and a series of meetings between senior U.S. and Israeli officials in recent days. So Trump was asked by reporters on Wednesday if he had warned Netanyahu against attacking Iran. And it's very interesting what Trump said. He said, quote, "Well, I like to be honest. Yes, I did. It's not a warning. I said, I don't think it's appropriate. We were having very good discussions with Iran, and I don't think it's appropriate right now. If we can settle it with a strong document, inspections, and no trust, I don't trust anybody. So no trust," end quote. So Trump added that he believed the U.S. and Iran are very close to a solution, but warned that it could change at any moment. So Trump has been threatening to bomb Iran. He's conducting these negotiations under the threat that if they fail, the U.S. will attack Iran. And this is despite the fact that U.S. intelligence agencies recently reaffirmed that there's no evidence Iran is trying to make a nuclear weapon. So the U.S. has been demanding that Iran eliminate its nuclear enrichment program altogether as part of any deal, and that's a condition that's a non-starter for Tehran. While the two sides appear to be far apart, there are reports that suggest an interim deal could be reached to buy time for further negotiations to reach a long-term agreement, and we'll get more into that in the next story. But Netanyahu, of course, he's also been demanding any deal, saying any deal must completely dismantle Iran's nuclear program. And of course, Israel is not going to be happy if the U.S. and Iran agree to some kind of interim deal. And the New York Times report said that Israel could launch an attack on Iran on its own, even though it's unlikely Israel could do any significant damage to Iranian nuclear facilities without U.S. support. So U.S. officials are concerned that Israel could strike Iran with little notice, and a unilateral attack could still get the U.S. involved. And this is a really important detail here. This New York Times report said that Israeli officials close to Netanyahu believe the U.S. would have no choice but to assist Israel militarily if Iran counterattacked. So they're essentially saying, well, if we just bomb Iran, then the U.S. will intervene to help us, when Iran hits us back. So essentially saying that they're thinking about attacking Iran to get the U.S. Into a war. So this is the country that many people call our greatest ally. So there are signs that the U.S. and Israel could also be considering a covert attack on Iranian nuclear facilities. The report said that CIA Director John Ratcliffe recently visited Israel to discuss covert operations. And Israel has a history of conducting attacks on Iranian soil, including assassinations, sabotage of nuclear facilities, little drone attacks, that are launched from inside Iran. And this is something, there's a big cyber attack that the U.S. and Israel did together against Iranian nuclear facilities back, I want to say 2012. I might have the year wrong, but back around then, called Stuxnet. So this is an option. Israel has some pretty serious intelligence capabilities inside Iran. All right, so the next one here, Iran denies that it would pause enrichment for an interim deal. So Iran's foreign ministry on Wednesday denied a report that said Tehran may pause uranium enrichment as part of a temporary deal with the U.S. So this is Iran's foreign ministry spokesman. He said, quote, "This report is simply false and fictitious. Enrichment is an integral part of our peaceful nuclear program, which stems from our inalienable right under the Non-Proliferation Treaty and is also enshrined in UN Security Council Resolution 2231, end quote. So the spokesman was responding to a report from Reuters that said Iran was considering a year-long pause on enrichment as part of a political agreement that would also involve the U.S. releasing some frozen Iranian funds, and also the U.S. recognizing Tehran's right to refine uranium for civilian purposes. So this is what the report said, and it said specifically Iran wants $6 billion of its own money that was frozen in South Korea due to U.S. sanctions. And then, if you remember, in 2023, before October 7th, the U.S. and Iran agreed to a prisoner swap deal. And part of that deal, the U.S. agreed to transfer the $6 billion from South Korea to Qatar. And then from there, Iran would be able to access it. Then after October 7th, the U.S. and Qatar agreed to freeze the $6 billion again, even though there was no evidence that Iran was involved. And also the fact that, Qatar, which, is known to have funded Hamas, that they're the ones who freeze the money is kind of ironic. But anyway, if you remember at the time, there was all these claims from Republicans that Biden gave Iran $6 billion right before October 7th, and that's why it happened. Well, Iran actually never got any of that money. So that's the specific funds that they're looking to get. And also, I think a U.S. recognition of Iran's right to enrich uranium could go a long way. But they're denying that they're willing to pause uranium enrichment altogether. And I wouldn't expect Iran to do that, but I do think there might be a chance of some kind of interim deal. That same New York Times report that talked about Netanyahu wanting to attack Iran also said that the U.S., that Steve Witkoff, the U.S. envoy who's been leading the negotiations with Iran, dropped his early objections to an interim understanding that lays out principles for a final deal. So apparently the U.S. was against any kind of interim thing. And as I understand it, the idea is like some kind of quick arrangement to give room for negotiations for a longer deal. And one thing that I think is possible is, Iran would probably be willing to agree to pausing uranium enrichment at the 60% and maybe even the 20% level if they get some kind of sanctions relief and a guarantee from the U.S. about a future deal. And that would certainly potentially, that would give Trump the talking point to say, oh, we stopped them from, enriching highly enriched uranium. So maybe that's a potential thing that could happen. So anyway, I think that's it here. I kind of went on a tangent there, but they're denying this report, but there's a lot of reports about some kind of, again, interim thing that could ease tensions and prevent a war. All right, so the next one here, Russia downs 296 Ukrainian drones. So the Russian Defense Ministry said Wednesday that its forces downed 296 Ukrainian drones over multiple Russian regions overnight, a barrage that Ukrainian media described as a record-breaking attack on Russian territory. According to Russia's TASS news agency, Ukrainian drones were downed over Moscow and over multiple other regions, including Bryansk, Belgorod, Vladimir, Voronezh, Ivanovo, Kaluga, Kursk, Oryol, Ryazan, Smolensk, Tver, and Tula. If you know, not that, many of you probably know where those areas are, but this is essentially, all over Western Russia that these drone attacks happen. If you see this map here from South Front showing where they were, shot down, and in some cases they did strike targets according to South Front. And this is what Ukrainian media said this as well, that one drone struck a drone manufacturing plant in the Moscow Oblast, as well as the ELMA Techno Park, which is an electronics development hub. A drone struck there as well. But besides that, it seemed like relatively limited damage. There was no reports of casualties, despite this. This is a huge number of drones. I know recently there's days where they fired more than 100, but I don't think they've ever even gotten close to this number here. So pretty big escalation of Ukrainian drone attacks. And they have stepped up the drone attacks in recent weeks. And as I covered last week, or maybe it was this week when I actually covered it, but it happened last week, a Russian commander said that Putin's helicopter was caught in a swarm of Ukrainian drones while he was visiting Russia's Kursk Oblast on May 20th. And from May 20th to May 23rd, Russia said that it intercepted 764 drones over its territory in those 3 days. And Russian officials cited these attacks as the justification for launching a massive drone and missile strikes on Ukraine over the weekend. According to Ukrainian officials, from Saturday to Monday, Russia launched nearly 1,000 missiles and drones into Ukraine, killing 13 civilians, including 3 children. So President Trump, that's when President Trump was saying, Putin's gone crazy. He's gone crazy. I don't know what happened here. That's what he was responding to. And, Russia's response to that is basically, well, he's not aware of everything that's going on, of all these Ukrainian attacks on our territory. And that's something that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on Wednesday. He said that Trump was not getting enough information about the war. I'll read the full quote. He said, quote, "One thing is clear, Donald Trump and those who actually make decisions regarding the Ukraine conflict in particular are not being told everything. The information he is given is filtered through a sieve, which is prepared by those who want to draw America into more aggressive action against Russia," end quote. And so, this is another thing. When Trump said Putin was going crazy, he was talking to reporters. Someone asked him about, did you hear there was an assassination attempt against Putin? I guess referring to the reports of the drone swarm near his helicopter. And Trump said that he didn't hear about it. And then he said something like, oh, well, if that's true, then maybe that is why they did the attack or something. So I think Russia kind of grabbed onto that, saying, you don't even know, your people aren't telling you everything. All right, so the next one here, Russia calls for second round of peace talks with Ukraine. So this one is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So it looks like despite all these escalations that the talks will go on. So Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says that Moscow has prepared a document outlining its position on ending the war in Ukraine, and he called for another round of negotiations in Turkey next week. He said, quote, "With the support of the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, it was possible to create conditions for the resumption of direct Russian-Ukrainian negotiations. The Russian side, as agreed, promptly developed a memorandum that sets out our position on all aspects of reliably overcoming the root causes of the crisis. Our delegation, headed by Vladimir Medinsky, is ready to present this memorandum to the Ukrainian delegation and provide the necessary explanations during the second round in Istanbul next Monday, June 2nd, end quote. So it looks like these negotiations will happen. The Ukrainians said something like, we have negotiators there, that they want to see a real proposal from Russia. So hopefully these talks happen. Hopefully there is some kind of progress made. And again, as I've been saying, what Trump really needs to do if he really wants to end this war is really leverage the military aid over Ukraine. And I think Russia's been showing, they're preparing to capture more territory in the northern areas to create this buffer zone. They're showing that as long as this war goes on, Ukraine's just going to keep losing territory and everything. All right, so the next one here, Israeli strikes killed dozens more in Gaza. So to get into the just horrific situation in Gaza here. So Israeli strikes killed dozens more Palestinians in Gaza on Wednesday as relentless U.S.-backed Israeli strikes continue to pound targets across the Strip. Gaza's health ministry said in its daily update, which it releases about midday Gaza time, that at least 23 Palestinians were killed over the previous 24 hours. And then medical sources told Al Jazeera that a total of 43 Palestinians were killed by Israeli attacks since early Wednesday morning. Excuse me. So Wafa, the Palestinian news agency, reported that yet another journalist was killed by the Israeli military, Moataz Mohammed Rajab, who worked for Al-Quds Al-Yum TV. So another journalist killed. You see this picture here of the Palestinians who were killed in shrouds. This is in the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City. So Rajab was killed along with several others in an Israeli attack on a vehicle in Gaza City. Other strikes included an Israeli attack in Jabalia, northern Gaza, that targeted a charging point for cell phones, killing 6 people. In the southern city of Khan Yunis, Israeli strikes killed at least 5 Palestinians. And Wafa also reported that 6 Palestinians were killed by Israeli gunfire at an aid distribution hub set up by the U.S. and Israeli-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation near the southern city of Rafah. The health ministry said that at least 1 Palestinian was killed and 48 were wounded when a crowd overran the aid distribution point on Tuesday. So the U.S. and Israeli aid scheme in Gaza has been widely condemned as it's not sufficient to feed the starving population after a more than 11-week total blockade. And the scheme also forces displaced Palestinians to make a long, dangerous journey to the distribution site in southern Gaza, where they are corralled into a small area and they undergo these identity checks. And they're, according to the accounts from the ground, they're getting their eyes scanned and things like that. And there's been some cases of people being arrested, disappeared basically, before receiving a box of food. And then in another sign of the desperation in Gaza, hundreds of starving Palestinians stormed a UN World Food Program warehouse in central Gaza on Wednesday. According to the Associated Press, at least 4 people died in the incident, including 2 people who were crushed by the crowd and 2 who died of gunshot wounds. And I linked to a story from AP there, and there's footage that shows, hundreds of people storming this warehouse and people walking out with big bags of flour. And you could hear some gunshots. So it's just a horrific situation, the desperate situation here. The next one here, Palestinians forced to trek miles for meager boxes of food. So this article is from Dropsite News by Rasha Abu Jalal, who's a Palestinian reporter in Gaza. And it's an account from some people who made the journey to receive this box of food, which they say is relatively small, and it's just kind of basic things like doesn't seem like there's any real protein in these boxes. So if you want to, people should get a feel for what it's like on the ground. It's a good report to go check out. All right, so the next one here, Pope Leo renews call for Gaza ceasefire. So on Wednesday, Pope Leo XIV renewed his call for a ceasefire in Gaza and lamented the death of Palestinian children who have been killed by Israeli forces in staggering numbers. He said, quote, "In the Gaza Strip, the intense cries are reaching heaven more and more from mothers and fathers who hold tightly to the bodies of their dead children," end quote. And he said this during his weekly general audience in St. Peter's Square at the Vatican. And I don't need to tell you guys that the child casualties have just been massive, and it's just such a horrific scale. It's at such a horrific scale. I mentioned in this that recently the health ministry published a list of 16,506 children who were killed by the Israeli military in Gaza since October 7th. And that list included 917 babies who did not make it to their first birthdays. And that list is likely a significant undercount. Those are all the people that they have fully identified. So anyway, so Leo, he also noted that the forced displacement of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, saying that they are constantly forced to move in search of food and shelter from the bombardment. He said, quote, "To those responsible, I renew my appeal. Stop the fighting, liberate all the hostages, and completely respect humanitarian law," end quote. The Pope also renewed his call for peace in Ukraine. He reiterated his appeal to stop the war and to support every initiative of dialogue and peace. And he invited Catholics to join in prayer for peace in Ukraine and wherever there is suffering because of war. So since, Leo hasn't even been in for a month yet, and this has been, he's made multiple calls for a ceasefire in Gaza. And I know some people, it's not, the language isn't strong enough for them, but I think I'm happy to see that he's making, this a priority, and just the issue of war in general. So, hopefully these calls continue and it can have an influence on American Catholics and Christians and, change the way people look at this. I mean, it seems like, a dam is breaking right now. There's so much criticism of Israel coming from all different places that it hasn't before. I just saw Piers Morgan, who is very supportive of Israel's destruction of Gaza. He's flipped, and he was grilling the Israeli ambassador to the UK, who just had no answers when he asked about certain things. So, things are definitely changing, and hopefully it leads to Trump. He's the one who's got to make the call and stop this. He's the one with the power. Maybe this could kind of have an influence on J.D. Vance. He's Catholic. I don't know. Just hopefully this stuff makes a difference. All right, so the next one here, Israel wants to stop Germany from hinting at an arms embargo. So this article is from The Cradle. So this is some of the criticism that they've been getting from the German government. And Germany is number 2 when it comes to the countries that provide weapons to Israel. Germany is number 2 behind the U.S. They provide, the U.S. provides way more weapons than Germany, but Germany provides a pretty significant chunk of Israel's military gear. So the Israeli government is conducting an intensive diplomatic campaign to prevent Germany from imposing or even suggesting a potential ban on arms exports to Israel, as reported by the Israeli public broadcaster Kan 11 on May 27th. So Tel Aviv is specifically looking to influence the office of German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and the German Foreign Ministry by claiming that the U.S. Israeli aid distribution mechanism in southern Gaza represents a dramatic and fundamental shift from the total blockade imposed since March. To achieve this, Israeli officials are attempting to influence German media to depict the current situation inside Gaza as a turning point or a game changer, despite the worsening famine, the forced displacement of millions, the rampant destruction, and Israel's control over aid delivery, which contradicts all humanitarian principles. So the efforts by Israel intensified after Merz publicly stated that the Western-sponsored genocide of Palestinians in Gaza was no longer justified. Merz said, quote, "What the Israeli army is now doing in the Gaza Strip, I frankly no longer understand with what goal," end quote. And we've seen France being a lot more critical and everything. So, all right, the next one here, Israeli airstrikes hit Yemen's Sanaa airport. So Israeli warplanes bombed the Sanaa International Airport in Yemen again on Thursday as the Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, have continued missile attacks on Israel in support of the Palestinians in Gaza. Yemeni officials said 4 strikes hit a runway at the airport. Khaled al-Shaif, the director of the Sanaa airport, said the attack destroyed the last operational plane used by Yemen's national airline and posted a photo on X of the aftermath of the attack. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz claimed that the attack hit terror targets at the airport. It looks like they just bombed the runway and a plane. So the airport just resumed limited service on May 17th after it had suspended all flights due to major Israeli airstrikes that hit on May 6th and left the facility totally disabled. Recent U.S. and Israeli airstrikes on Yemeni civilian infrastructure and new U.S. sanctions on the Houthis, who govern an area where 70 to 80% of Yemenis live. The airstrikes and the sanctions have exacerbated an already dire humanitarian crisis in the country. So it is not good. And so Ansar Allah leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi said on Wednesday that the Israeli attacks would not deter Yemen. He said, quote, "No matter the size of Israeli aggression and no matter how often it repeats, it will not affect our people's stance in supporting the Palestinian people. The Israeli enemy remained in a weak position following the cessation of American aggression due to its failure," end quote. And Trump portrayed the ceasefire with the Houthis as a victory, but really the U.S. just gave up trying to get them to stop targeting Israel. All right, so the next one here, 1 killed in Israeli drone strike in southern Lebanon. So Israel continued its attacks against southern Lebanon overnight Tuesday into Wednesday. At least 1 person was reported killed in a strike against the village of Yatir. 2 drone missiles were fired at a motorcycle in the village, killing the person riding it. The IDF presented the unnamed victim as a senior Hezbollah commander, which is what they always say. They claim that this guy was attempting to reestablish Hezbollah's presence in this area. They claimed it was a blatant ceasefire violation, what this guy was doing, which is just very rich to hear Israel accusing the other side of ceasefire violations when they've violated the ceasefire thousands of times. Continue to bomb Lebanon every day, occupying these 5 outposts in southern Lebanon. This is going on with very little media attention. All right, so the next one here, Israel and Syria reportedly engage in direct security talks. So another one from Jason. So according to reports citing unnamed sources, Israel and Syria have held recent direct security talks with one another, and the talks are said to have happened in the wake of indirect talks between the two sides involving intermediaries, which have been confirmed. The reports say that the direct talks involved a group of Syrian personnel, including Ahmad al-Dalati, formerly the appointed governor of Quneitra Governorate, who just this week was also put in charge of security in Sueda. The talks are meant to reduce the scope of the ongoing Israeli invasion and occupation of southwest Syria. Israel invaded Syria in December after the ouster of the Assad government by the Islamist HTS, which leads the country now. Israel and the HTS have been engaged in secret talks since April, and that, I believe, has been confirmed by Shara, the indirect talks, but now there has been some denial about this report that they're having direct talks with Israel because there's been some domestic backlash, and the official that this report said participated in the talks issued a statement denying that he participated. But I'm sure if these exact direct talks aren't happening, some sort of talks between Syria and Israel do seem to be ongoing. This is a demand that the U.S. had in order to lift sanctions on Syria. All right, so the next one here, Israel's Smotrich calls for rebuilding the temple. So this article is from Middle East Eye. So far-right Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich has called for the rebuilding of a Jewish temple on the site of Al-Aqsa Mosque and for the expansion of Israel's borders and Jewish settlements in Gaza. In a speech addressing crowds at a Jerusalem Day rally on Monday, which celebrates Israel's occupation of the old city of Jerusalem, Smotrich also called for complete redemption and reconstruction of the temple here, referring to Al-Aqsa Mosque, which settlers had raided earlier. He said, quote, "We are conquering the land of Israel, liberating Gaza, settling Gaza, and defeating the enemy. With God's help, we will expand Israel's borders, bring about complete redemption, and rebuild the temple here," end quote. And so this is the crowd, the Jerusalem Day crowd. These were the people chanting "Death to Arabs" and "May your village burn" as they march through the old city. Smotrich also reiterated his call for Jewish settlement in Gaza, declaring that Israel is not afraid of the word occupation. So, when he talks about rebuilding the temple, I mean, this is a really sensitive thing because obviously if they claim that the Al-Aqsa Mosque was a site of one of the Jewish temples. And so the idea is if they want to rebuild it there, they got to destroy Al-Aqsa, which, of course, would set off a big war. And the other angle of this is that a lot of Christian Zionists believe that rebuilding, building the third temple will bring about the end times, I think, the idea is that it'll bring about the Antichrist, and then, which isn't a very good thing. I don't think you should be trying to, bring about the Antichrist in the end times. So, but that is a big part of the theology of these Christian Zionists who have a lot of influence on our government. I mean, this is like Mike Huckabee and people like that. So it's just concerning stuff to see this. All right, so the next one here, court says that Trump does not have authority to set tariffs. This one is from Axios. This just came out not too long before I started recording, but it seems like a pretty big deal. A federal court on Wednesday ruled President Trump does not have the authority under economic emergency legislation to impose sweeping global tariffs. The U.S. Court of International Trade's ruling could bring the administration's trade war to a screeching halt. By blocking entirely most categories of tariffs, the court effectively wiped out most of the regime Trump put in place since taking office. The court, ruling in two separate cases, issued a summary judgment throwing out all the tariffs Trump imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And I believe this was the Liberation Day tariffs, when Trump basically tariffed the whole world. So this is good because the tariffs obviously raise prices for Americans, and he imposed a whole bunch of them. There's been so much uncertainty over everything, but we'll see how this plays out after this ruling. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Brad Pierce: lone assassins never achieve their political goals. One from Ted Snyder: does no one want peace in Ukraine? One from Judge Napolitano: punishing freedom trumps attack on the First Amendment. One from Patrick Lawrence: waves upon the sea of silence. And our spotlight is from Abdel Halim Eldel Rahman: Trump should recognize a Palestinian state. So please go check all that out. Check out our blog. We have Ron Paul's show over there. Kyle Anzalone's great show. His show, The Kyle Anzalone Show, he's been getting really great guests. He just had Scott Horton on, but it's been he's had a lot of good people on. So definitely go check out his show. If you're watching on YouTube, go subscribe his channel. I think the channel is The Kyle Anzalone Show. Yeah, anyway, that's it. If you want to support us, you could always share this show, tell your friends about antiwar.com, like, subscribe, comment. All that stuff helps out. Follow us on social media. I will be back tomorrow. One more show this week. Thanks for listening.